Hello, this is your host of PoliTalks, Eric Hacopian, and we're pleased to have as our guest today sociologist Georgi Derluguian, one of the most insightful sociologists in our world today. Professor Derluguian's specialty is in ethnic violence, guerrilla movements, and revolutions, particularly in the Caucasus, Central Asia, and Africa, as well as the post-war, Cold War globalization. He's currently a professor of social research and public policy at New York University of Abu Dhabi. Professor Derluguian is quadrilingual and, fair to say, a Renaissance man who has worked in over the past 35 years and as places as different as Russia, Mozambique, the United States, and the United Arab Emirates. Professor Derluguian, it's a pleasure to have you on our show.
Thank you for inviting.
I wanted to ask you, you obviously, because of your profession, have a different view of a lot of contemporary issues that is not, that people are used to hearing from a political perspective. What do you think, what does it mean to be Armenian in the 21st century? And what I mean by that is this a universalist nation and people in the sense that it is spread from all over the world, that one can be Argentine and Armenian, one can be French and Armenian, or is it, or are we an exclusivist group of people or a nation in which your ties are far more limited and not as universal as you would be otherwise? How would you explain that? What's your take of that?
Well, first let me explain what many people assume they know, but they probably don't, even if they took sociology classes in college. What I study is how things actually work. This is very much like geology, the kind of people who study volcanoes or earthquakes. So what do? You go there and you look on site, so how do they happen? Each volcano is different from another volcano. However, there is kind of broad pattern of similarities. They are not always the same. Not every feature is present in every earthquake or volcano. They're very difficult to predict, but they're explicable. So the main question we ask is why, not how much, like economists, not when, like historians, not who, but why. Why did it happen the way it did? So we also study the formation of modern nations. One of the major areas of research since the 1980s, and in itself it begs a very interesting question, why? Why since the 1980s we pay so much attention to nations and nationalism? And the counterintuitive explanation is that because nations began declining at this time. Nations have not been always present in human history because there were tribes at some point, but the most important identification through the what we call Middle Ages was religion, world religion. It mattered much more to be Muslim or Christian of a certain denomination. And as you probably know, West European educated elites spoke Latin way past the time Latin was a live language. Like especially the monks, the clerics used it. And then came the time when nations became very important because nation associated with nation state. This is my state. This is Germany and we are German. This is France and we are French. Armenians on this score are quite special. I used to argue with one of my teachers, Benedict Anderson, who was the classic of the studies of nationalism. Are Armenians actually exceptional? Because Armenians have been identifiable since long before modernity. This is because it just happens in this kind of volcano that religion and nation coincided. Right? It happens in other cases as well. It happens with Jews. It happens in certain circumstances with Irish Catholic, with Greek Orthodox. It does happen. Even Persians, they are Muslim, but they're Shia. So there is something special about it always. So there is one thing reinforcing another. Language, culture, religion. However, in the late 20th century, states began opening up, and especially after the collapse of Soviet Union. Massive flows, not only of refugees. Of course, there are lots of refugees in this world, but there are lots of people who are in kind of gray area. You know, how do we classify all those highly skilled specialists and scientists who had left the Soviet Union after the collapse of Soviet Union and its science? That includes myself. You know, the people, you know, who otherwise would have been Soviet scholars, but we became American or French or global scholars. You know, so we earn our living all around the world. And the question does still stand, you know, what makes people Armenian, and does it actually matter? And my answer would be yes, it does matter, but it probably matters not in the way as it used to be because we are members of a certain church, or because we are members, we carry the passport of a country called Armenia. So it's actually what you posited is a question for a good Nobel Prize piece of research, except that, of course, there are no Nobel Prizes in social sciences.
Looking, it's very interesting you say that. One of the things that I've always been intrigued by, you know, you can look at these old maps, and there are very few. If you look at a map from 1500, 2000 years ago, you'll see a lot of names, and there's very few of those names that are still around or even relevant. Armenia is one of them. What does that say about this culture that it persisted in sometimes the most horrific of circumstances, and others have not? And I'm not asking this from a nationalistic point of view, because the answer you might give me is not the one that a nationalists want to hear, because we're special, or because sometimes you can be so incorrigible that, you know, other people say, okay, it's not worth doing this, let's move on and be something else. What do you think explains the fact that this group of people are still around 2,000 years ago, from 2,000 years ago, if not longer, when if you look at, there's plenty of reasons for them not to be?
You know, when I was younger, I also thought so. And then it's probably just the social scientific set of mind that suddenly reminded me, well, the first mentioning of Armenians, you know, when Armenians are mentioned by this name, are the Behistun rock inscription by the Persian king. Wait a minute, but Persians are still around. Right, you know, Persians, yes, you know, they're different Persians, you know, from 5th or 6th century BC, but they're still around. And the second is, of course, the Xenophon's Anabasis, you know, the march of 10,000 Greek mercenaries across the, you know, when they were fleeing from defeat in the middle of Persia, across the Armenian highlands, and the Greeks are still around. So how unique really are Armenians? Yes, you know, there is a certain category. It's very much like with animal species, you know, what they call it, you know, living fossils. Why are they around? Well, you know, because they somehow, you know, they fit the environment. They developed special adaptations, and there are quite many of those. Speaking, by the way, of the purity of blood, you know, sometimes I get, well, I have to answer. It is annoying, you know, but the question is posited, you know, by very sincere people, you know, like, who are the oldest nation on the planet? And my answer would be the Khoisan, you know, the Bushmen people in southern Africa, evidently. Their language and their DNA analysis now shows that they have been separate for tens of thousands of years. Australian Aborigines, because their ancestors got into this continent and no new blood had ever coming in. And maybe Eskimo. So basically, you know, you stay very pure-blooded if you are isolated, right? Armenians, however, were at the crossroads of history. So that makes it even more interesting. But again, you know, you look around and Armenians are in the category with the Irish, for instance, you know, because Celts, you know, whose successors today are only Irish, Cornish, Scotch, some people in France, you know, called the Breton, quite a few. But they used to be a very big nation in the times of Roman Empire. You know, they're mostly gone. You know, they have been from central Anatolia, Galatians. Galatians mean Gaul, right? You know, they were Celts. from lower Danube and all the way to Ireland. Today they survive mostly in Ireland. They lost much of their language. However, well, you must have seen in America, those wonderful T-shirts, hug me, I'm Irish. Right. How different is it from Armenians? Let me ask you. So, first of all, let's establish, that there is a whole class of nations. However, they survived. They all, survived through very grievous medieval depredations. Why did they survive? So, what do Jews, Greeks, Celts, and Armenians, and probably Persians share in common? As I said, religion, which marked them, and the way they worked inside the foreign empires for many hundreds of years. They were usually subordinate populations. It was difficult. Majority of them, almost all of them, lost their native warrior elites because the original ruling classes were warriors. There are only three kinds of ruling classes. I play with my students, this game. Okay, let's have a reality show in this class. Who wants to be an emperor? That's the title of it. And there are only three possibilities, right? How can you create power in pre-modern, but even in the modern world? So we dig archaeologically, some ancient mound, and we find a splendid skeleton. Who that could be? There are only three possibilities. It's a warrior who robbed other people at sword point. It's a merchant, because they managed to trade in something which could not be immediately robbed because it's too far away, it's difficult to transport something, it requires special knowledge. Or it's a priest. So it's priest, merchant, warrior, right? There are three possibilities. Original elites were largely warriors in ancient world, but Armenians, also Persians actually in Islamic invasions, Greeks, they lost their warrior elites. However, don't forget, that Armenians are not unique even in the Caucasus. Look next door, Georgians. Georgian language is a separate linguistic family of its own. It's a very ancient language. It's traceable to at least Bronze Age. The peoples of the North Caucasus, the Chechens, the Dagestanis, no longer have relatives speaking their language anywhere outside the North Caucasus. However, as you probably know, the Urartu cuneiform writings are related to anything than to Dagestani languages and to Abkhaz, right? Not to Armenian. So it doesn't mean that there were no Armenians. Just the language like Latin in medieval Europe, was not exactly the language what people really spoke in daily life. By the way, very good question. What did Richard the Lionheart speak? It was probably not English. Like, he was of French origin. It was probably some kind of... What Charlemagne spoke is an even bigger question. What he really spoke. Because he wrote Latin, whenever, he could say something, but was it something ancient Germanic or ancient French or Old French? Yeah, it's anyone's guess, So Armenians lost their warrior elites, but Armenians preserved, and they had to preserve or develop, their priesthood, which in modern times becomes intelligentsia, outsized intelligentsia, and the merchants and the craftsmen. And that really helped, because Armenians had to, it's like, you lose a limb and you gain dexterity in what remains, special dexterity. So Armenians, in the very rough terms, I'm not speaking here to a scientific audience, so I'm trying to, to bring this metaphor. So Armenians came to the 20th century with this rather special set of skills and with a special feeling of themselves, which is not entirely unique. Special doesn't mean totally unique, however, it's there. Now the question is, in the 21st century, when it's all about, say, the internet, mobility, and countries of gigantic size like China are opening up to the world, when the Arab world is on the move for not very happy reasons, but Africa is on the move. What is going to happen to Armenians? And you ask very important questions. I don't know the answer, but I know how things tend to be.
You made some comments a couple of years ago. I think it was at a conference, which some people were critical of. And one thing that you said, and this was even prior to the revolution, is that I'm paraphrasing this, but you essentially said, given the neighborhood that Armenia is in, we should, we should be far more content about the state of the country, or the situation, the political situation, the economic situation in the country, given the state of our neighborhood. What did you mean by that? And I want to give you a chance to explain what your position was in layman's terms.
Well, there is a tendency which is very Armenian these days, to be very darkly pessimistic. And that is actually good for creating poetry and maybe film. Not very good in economy, less so even in military or political affairs. So when you know that things are bad, this tends to become self-fulfilling prophecy. And by the way, self-fulfilling prophecy is not merely a proverb. It's the title, which very few people realize, of a famous theoretical article by American sociologist Robert Merton from the late 1940s, Self-Fulfilling Prophecy. Why things which you expect or fear tend to pass. So I was trying to reposition, the self-perception of Armenians. And this is, by the way, also very similar to what's happening with Greeks now, for instance. My friend and colleague, professor at Yale, Stasis Kalivas, who is Greek, recently published a book with Polity Press called Greece, What Everyone Needs to Know, where he argues that Greece is doing vastly better for everything that has been happening over the last 200 years, that Greeks failed to conquer Constantinople. That Greeks are, of course, notorious now for the disaster in their finances. But still, Greece should have been, if ever at all, such a country was to reemerge, and it was not a given. That modern Greece should have belonged somewhere in North Africa or the Middle East. However, it is in Europe. It is at the edge of Europe, but it is in Europe. The country does survive. So let's look around. So there is Armenia. There is an Armenian state at the moment. There is fairly coherent population with impressive skills, with very impressive global diaspora, with lots of contacts, and with something which we call social capital. But what is social capital? Social capital is basically the legacy of past success. It's what you know how to do, it's know-how, and with whom to do. Again, anyone who had done business knows this. It comes to you naturally when you know how to do things and you know with whom you're going to do things. Armenians have a lot of that. We survived, and many people actually do not even appreciate how big was the shock of the collapse of Soviet Union. In the 20th century, Armenians have survived already at least 2 major collapses.
And World War II.
And as a result, however, there is still in Armenia, there is still diaspora, and there is, so many things which we take for granted. It was just politically upgraded, so I was fearful, of course, so what happened, of the direction, where it was going, because, how should I say, there was the feeling, that we reached a dead end. It was a year ago. And there was a fear, and because I know how revolutions happen, that revolutions tend to be quite destructive. Because what is a revolution? You grab the steering wheel from the driver because the driver is unfit, or you think the driver is unfit. But you must do it at full speed. This is a dangerous maneuver. It happened in Armenia, and it happened without a wreck. That in itself is something quite encouraging. So let's look around, think, and invoking the American expression, let's count our blessings. And there are quite a few.
What would you, I know where you come from politically, what would you consider a socially and economically successful Armenian state? And I know it's not going to be the same vision as a neoliberal economist would. How would you describe that in your own vision? What would you count as success?
You have to realize it's not so much about politics, that I am a historical sociologist again, so I'm not into normative thinking. Normative is how things should be.
I'm not interested in normative thinking.
Yes.
That's what we
but
have.
Lots of people do this. I'm into analyzing the environment and what is possible in this environment, and there are different possibilities, and what would be then the best practical possibility, not the impractical, because there are lots of Armenians who take pride in proposing totally impractical ideas. They feel great about saying something which, like, I wish we all could fly. I consider sociology a kind of engineering. So when you say that, I wish we had wings and could fly, that's poetry or political rhetoric. When you say that, I wish to be airborne and fly, we have to go to the drawing board and figure out, oh, all right, so there is such a wish. How can we lift human body safely into the air, move it, and bring it back to Earth safely? That's what is social engineering. So I would say that this is a post-Soviet country. It's impoverished because it used to be an important part of military-industrial state. It's not that the Soviet Union or the Bolsheviks meant specifically to do something very good for Armenians. They were building a military superpower to oppose the capitalist environment, to oppose the Nazis, and then repel, sustain the American pressure during the Cold War. For this, they needed world-class military. That required a lot of science and technology. That required educated population, and Armenians turned out fit quite well into this vision, and many Armenians made splendid careers at that time. Now, that vision had collapsed with the Soviet Union. So what do we have? Do we have enough private capitalist investment at the moment? Or let's put it differently, why would investment capital at all come here, except for maybe some patriotic reasons? Where to invest and in what? While many people would say that corruption, such a bad and immoral thing, I would say corruption is one of the most ubiquitous features in the world. Like, I've taught in Chicago for 15 years. You tell me something, yeah. Tell me something about corrupt politicians. This is what they do. However, there are moments in history when corruption could be reined in. And when does it happen? It usually takes a lot of patriotic effort. Corruption usually is overcome with the realization that we are fighting a war. And this is a moment of survival. It also needs strong direction, both economic development and social reordering. And that would have to be a state. So the problem I see with purely neoliberal recommendations, that they are necessary but insufficient. Necessary that, yes, of course, you have to fight against corruption, and actually it's known how to do it. It's not really such a secret. It's difficult, very much like with losing weight. We all know that you should stop smoking and drinking too much coffee and that you should exercise.
You need political will.
That political will comes from the state. That's the thing, that especially in the countries which are not in the center of the world, say, in sociology, starting a new journal somewhere in England, especially in the United States, is actually easy. Why? Everybody would like to publish because it's a British journal, or it's anything which is published in the United States tends to become high ranking because it's already in English. If you are somewhere in Armenia, you face much higher barriers to entry in the markets. And how do you do that? And there are actually examples. And to cite again, the examples of what we call developmental states. That's Israel, that's Republic of Ireland, but also South Korea and Singapore. Their state, for the lack of whatever, foreign investment, common will, state had to assume leading
directional power.
Yes, and it had to help the capital. So I would say the problem is that when you speak to socialists, they say this is horrible because you are preaching for capitalism. When you speak with people who believe, that they are very private capitalists, and they're horrified because what you are talking about, state is by definition corrupt. Much worse than private enterprise. First of all, this is actually ideological abstraction. There are plenty of examples of private and corporate misbehavior in the world. Second, there are real examples of states which did well, especially in the second half of 20th century. I just mentioned that. That's Israel, that's Singapore, that's South Korea. Why did they do better? Because they felt cornered. These are the states which felt that they could disappear. And that's actually this kind of situation, when people really begin to exercise and they take seriously medical advice.
Well, one thing that has struck me living here for the last couple of years is, by any measure, when you look at the world, countries like Germany and France are far more successful, far more affluent, and I would say most people in this country would aspire to be like France, like Germany in their lifestyles, economic development. However, when you look at those countries, you see this almost this existential angst. You see in Germany, the most best-selling book was Thilo Sarrazin's Germany Abolishes Itself, and you have in France, Michel Houellebecq, who's writing about submission and the takeover of the Muslim fundamentalists of France, sort of way out there things. And then you come to this country that has problems that I don't need to repeat because everybody knows what their problems are. But you don't seem to have that existential angst here. This seems to be a society for all of its problems that is secure in who it is and where it comes from, even if it's not certain or where it's going. How do you explain this juxtaposition between the affluent who are despairing and the not affluent who are far more comfortable in their skin, or appear to be?
Well, the affluent can afford to despair, to play the games of despair, right? Because they are really not so worse off, as they tend to assume. And the affluent are not very good benchmark for a place like Armenia, because they have been different since the great discoveries. So I'm sorry, here the problem with my discipline is that I need to lecture a lot simply because people assume that they know since, say, their school years, what is France, and in fact they don't. That's the problem, because unlike, say, astrophysicists, I have to explain, that it's less evident than it seems, that France in medieval times, France and Germany, they had very fertile kind of feudalism. Feudalism is actually a very fertile process when old imperial power, which was always very corrupt. If only you knew how terrible was Rome, especially late Roman Empire. But it fell apart and it left in places like France and even in Germany a lot of legacies. Same with Armenia, by the way. The legacies, the languages were there, like, they're using Latin alphabet, the cities have been founded by Romans already, they inherited the monasteries and so forth. And then, what is the difference with Armenia? The difference is simply, that Germany and France have been far enough from nomadic invaders from the steppe. So they had feudalism and they didn't pay the price. Armenia did pay the price, terrible price in medieval times, because it was within the range. Second, France and Germany, but even more so British Isles, they were just a fairly small ocean away from two continents in the New World, from two Americas which were totally defenseless against them and offered lots of opportunities and resources. So these are not very good benchmarks for a place like Armenia. So the benchmark in Armenia is, as I said, is more in, say, Eastern Europe, Middle East. These used to be the cradles of civilization. Like, what happened to Mesopotamia? What happened to the Nile Valley? Nile Valley is Egypt. Mesopotamia is Iraq. Right? What happened to Indus Valley civilization? It's Pakistan, mostly today. Afghanistan used to be known as the country of gardens. Where are the gardens? things like that. So Armenia is in a very difficult neighborhood, that's to begin, and that's again Georgia, the North Caucasus, our neighbors, our very close analogies. There is a Russian proverb, "Не было бы счастья, да несчастье помогло." I can translate it as, for the lack of luck, misfortune came to help. So Armenians were unlucky, royally unlucky in medieval times, and then misfortune shaped a very tight nation. You know, this is a very basic rule of sociology, going back to one of our classics, Emil Durkheim. Nothing creates higher solidarity within the group than external conflict. So there is external conflict, as we realize. This creates, a very special kind of internal cohesion. This cohesion is predicated on even earlier conflicts, which are expressed in the peculiar shape of Armenian church and Armenian alphabet. So it was today it's very difficult even to imagine, but Armenian alphabet had emerged not so much for cultural purposes. It was a geopolitical choice to be with neither Persians nor Greeks nor Romans. Yeah, to be independent. So we have to build from that. We have to. A lot is predicated now on very soberly and consistently restudying the history of Armenia to understand what we can do, what is possible, what are the differences between us and Western Europe. We are very lucky precisely because the country is relatively closed so far. The country is small and nobody wants to, very few people actually want to migrate here, unlike Germany and unlike France. And this gives us an opportunity. It's like in a chessboard, that there are big pieces which move like that, and there are smaller pieces. And you must be able to see the opportunity in a small piece somewhere in the periphery, moving in a smart way here and there. It actually can become a winning proposition.
Very good answer, very interesting one. One of going through your readings, I found something that was fascinating to me, and I think it was unique to your professional background that you comment on, or you noticed it, and you were at the front lines in Karabakh, and then you had written about how these young 18, 19-year-old conscripts, of how well kept and clean their lines were, and how well kept their equipment was, even though some of it was dated. And these same conscripts, in April of 2016, took on the Azeri Special Forces, which a lot of people don't know that, but it was in the beginning of this 4-day war. It was essentially Armenian 18, 19-year-olds versus, Israeli and Turkish trained special forces. And for the most part, they held their ground or they routed them. And you also commented how little of the macho bravado that is so common in the Caucasus, they did not have in the way they were acting or the way they behave. How do you explain their behavior? How do you explain what you noticed, and why is it relevant?
Part of sociology, at least the way I practice it, is the method of observation, being observant. It's very difficult. I train students specifically. You need to be trained in this, to notice what nobody notices because it's right under your nose. So in foreign countries, when I take the students, foreign countries, I once took 18 students from United Arab Emirates to Yerevan because it's the nearest very foreign country to them. It would be very different from Abu Dhabi and Dubai. To notice with a fresh look what the locals don't notice. What fascinates the Emiratis when they come to Yerevan? Wow, their houses are built of stone, real natural stone, and very beautiful. They have these wonderful drinking fountains in the street. Like, you take it for granted, right? That meat is wonderful, food is great, and it's very safe. You don't have to look very much around, people are hospitable, and the biggest winter fascination is there is snow. It's snowing there, and fish from fresh water tastes different from saltwater fish from the Arabic Gulf, so forth. In any country, I always suggest begin your journey by spending 15 minutes at traffic light, if there is a traffic light in this country, and observe what do people do at traffic light. Tells you a lot about politics immediately. Visit, if you can, cemetery, bazaar, and football stadium. It will tell you a lot about the nature of the people there. So once again, in Armenia, we have very different gender roles, so you, of course, hear so much, so social science in the West is obsessed with gender, but gender is not only about women, it's also about men, and how do they behave, what does it take to be a real man in a culture. And here, because once again, for the luck of historical luck, misfortune came to the rescue of Armenians. We lost in medieval battles almost entirely our feudal warrior class. So there is nobody to show off, like in Spain, all these hidalgos, and dons, noble dons with their swords, or like in Poland, or even in Georgia, where before 1917, whole 7% of population claimed nobility. Right, it's a lot, a lot of princes around. Here you don't have them. Here, women have had to play historically a very big role in sustaining the families. And men, therefore, in my observations, are pretty secure. They can be relaxed. They know that the head of the family de facto, if not de jure, is mom, and eventually it becomes your wife, if you're lucky enough. And what it remains is to follow the commands of the women in the household. Now, this could sound almost as ethnic stereotype or nearly a joke. However, there is good evidence, and we collect this kind of evidence as sociologists, that strikes, riots, revolutions where women are present tend to become much more radical than where women are not. Yeah, well, why coal miners, for instance, are more radical typically, or used to be when there were coal mines? Because their strikes were happening in the towns and hamlets where they used to live. So women, entire family would be there. So for this, watch the great French movie Germinal or read Émile Zola's classic. Why it is such a big battle, and what is a nation if not a family? And again, so how do you imagine Armenia? So behind you, you can see, that great statue, Mother Armenia, right? So mother commands. And what is the job of Armenian men? Well, you have to go and earn a living, probably not near your home because there are not so many jobs. So Armenians have been very disciplined migrant laborers, and people tend to fight wars almost exactly as they work. So Germans, for better or for worse, are very good soldiers because they make also very good cars, and they're good craftsmen at that. And Americans tend to be as well. They're very technological. It's a very techy army because American culture is all about gadget, and it has been like that for the last 200 years. Armenians are the nation of laborers, largely. And this is actually quite different, from, say, the North Caucasus, where men, say, like in Chechnya, they're under very strong pressure from the peers to show off, to prove themselves in acts of bravery at the level, beyond whatever is reasonable, jumping off the cliffs. Or in Georgia, where you have to be very outgoing. It's wonderful behavior, of course, at dinner table. You have to be very generous and outgoing, and you must outdo everyone else in hospitality. But it does interfere with such tasks as maintaining tank engines, which is dirty and quite heavy labor. And I saw it because at some point in the early 1990s, I traveled around the Caucasus, and I did watch how Georgian tanks were maintained, and how Chechen weapons were maintained, and how Armenian weapons were maintained, and pretty much like the households. So sociology is about seeing the whole society. one thing goes into the other thing. And Armenians, once again, so Armenians have an advantage which they don't notice. And to finish with this, to cite the events of exactly 1 year ago in Yerevan, right? The non-violence of Armenian police, right? So what happened, that once women joined, and you remember, that there were famous pictures, women, moms with strollers, with babies. First of all, it's pretty damn incredible that in Yerevan, it's historically safe to come to barricades with babies in strollers. This is not what is happening typically. Well, I'm not even referring to
It's not happening in Paris today.
Yeah. But yeah, it's pretty damn incredible. And of course, it puts a lot of pressure on everyone, including the police and the authorities. And plus, of course, it was absolutely out of question using force on the 24th of April last year. And to the, I might make again political enemies here, but at some point we would have to acknowledge the role of Ser Sargsyan in surrendering in orderly fashion, as he did, because he did care. He realized, that the party was lost, and he did what he ought to do.
He did not cross the line he shouldn't have crossed. I think history will give him that, if nothing else.
Yes.
I think, first of all, it's been a fascinating conversation from a very interesting perspective. I want to thank you for being our guest, and it was an absolute pleasure to have you on our show.
Thank you.